All right, so get ready because this one's a wild ride.
Bro.
We're going to deep dive into the Kendhammer case.
Ooh, yeah, this one's a doozy.
It's not just any accident, right? It's one of those stories where, like, every time you think you've figured it out,
There's another twist.
there's another twist, yeah. And we're heading to rural Wisconsin for this one. So, picture this.
Small town vibes.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone knows their neighbors. Things seem peaceful,
On the surface.
on the surface, right?
Yeah.
We've got Barbara and Todd Kendhammer.
Celebrating their 25th anniversary.
Yeah, you'd think they'd have, years ahead of them.
Happily ever after.
Happily ever after. But then,
Everything changes.
in an instant,
Yeah, this case is like a prime example of how quickly things can change, how our perceptions can shift.
oh yeah,
You think you're looking at one thing and then bam,
totally.
it's something else entirely.
So it's September 16th, 2016. Todd Kendhammer calls 911, and it's frantic. He's saying a pipe flew off a truck, smashed through their windshield, and hit Barbara.
That 911 call, it's like raw emotion, chaos. You can practically hear the scene unfolding.
It's intense. So first responders arrive, and they see the shattered windshield, right? Todd's there trying to save his wife.
It's a chaotic scene, for sure. Easy to get swept up in the emotion of it all.
Absolutely. But here's where things get interesting. A trainee officer is there.
Just doing his thing.
Yeah, just going through the motions, practicing procedures. And he starts noticing things that,
Don't quite add up.
yeah,
Like little details.
little things.
Like dirt on the passenger seat, but the car's in a grassy ditch.
Oh,
Or there's blood on the rear tire rim.
okay.
These inconsistencies, they're like red flags, tiny cracks in a seemingly solid story.
It's like he had this subconscious sense, something's not right.
Yeah, like a sixth sense almost.
Right, and it's crucial because it makes investigators start questioning everything.
Exactly. That's what good investigators do. They don't just take things at face value. They dig deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And those cracks in Todd's story, well, let's just say they became gaping holes when the autopsy results came back.
Yeah. This is where it all changes, right?
Oh, yeah, big time. The autopsy tells a completely different story than what Todd's saying.
So what did they find?
Okay, so instead of injuries you'd expect from a pipe coming through the windshield, Barbara had lacerations and blunt force trauma to the back of her head.
The back of her head.
Yeah, think about that. How does a pipe flying through the front windshield hit the back of her head?
It doesn't make sense.
Exactly. And there's more. Broken nose, bruised lips, scratches on her neck.
Those sound more like injuries from an assault, not some freak accident.
You got it. It completely changes the focus of the investigation. Now, those injuries combined with Todd's bloody knuckles, they cast a serious shadow of suspicion over him.
Okay, so now investigators are really starting to doubt Todd's story.
And things are about to get even more complicated.
What happens next?
Well, they start looking into Todd's alibi. And that's when the inconsistencies really start piling up.
Oh boy. What do you mean?
He claimed he was driving to a friend's house to pick up a truck. Turns out the friend was on vacation, had never even been to that house.
So his alibi falls apart?
Completely.
Hmm.
And then there's the timeline of that morning. Barbara was known for being punctual, always at work by 8:00 a.m. sharp.
Right.
But based on Todd's story, she would have been super late.
That's a huge red flag.
Right. And we can't forget about how Todd was acting after Barbara's death. Witnesses said he was oddly calm, almost happy at times.
That's disturbing. It doesn't fit the picture of a grieving husband.
Exactly. So we've got a dead wife, a husband whose story is crumbling, and a growing feeling that this is much more than a tragic accident.
So where do we go from here?
Well, this is where the forensic evidence really takes center stage.
Okay, let's talk about that.
We're going to dive into the details of the car and what the experts found. Okay, so the car itself becomes like a treasure trove of clues. A lot of the physical evidence centers around the vehicle.
All right, so let's break that down. What did they find?
One of the biggest things was blood spatter analysis. Remember Todd's story? The pipe coming through the windshield, hitting Barbara while she's in the passenger seat?
Yeah.
Well, the blood patterns didn't match that at all. There was blood on the steering wheel, blood on the dash, but almost none on the passenger side window.
So that means she wasn't hit while she was sitting there. Does that mean she was injured somewhere else in the car?
Possibly. And remember that blood on the rear tire rim we talked about?
Yeah.
Plus, they found a lot of pooling blood, which means a longer bleed time than the pipe scenario would allow. So maybe Barbara was bleeding for a while before that 911 call.
That's a scary thought. It really changes the timeline.
For sure. And then you've got the windshield itself. Analysis showed 2 impact points near where the pipe was launched.
2 impact points.
Yeah, almost like the pipe was pushed through the windshield. Not flown off a truck at high speed.
Wait a second. Wasn't there a witness who saw the car in the ditch that morning?
Oh, yeah. The Frywaller.
Yeah.
He said he saw the car, but no windshield damage. Completely contradicts Todd's whole story.
So the physical evidence from the car directly goes against what Todd said. We have a fake alibi, a timeline that doesn't make sense, and now forensic evidence pointing towards a staged scene. What's the prosecution's theory at this point?
Well, based on all the evidence, they think there was an argument or a fight at home. Maybe Barbara was already hurt, possibly from a broken nose, and they were driving around.
So she could have been trying to escape, and that's how they ended up in the ditch.
That's a possibility.
Hmm.
The prosecution thinks Todd then attacked Barbara outside the car, causing those severe head injuries. Maybe he hit her head against the rear tire rim. Explains the blood there and the type of injuries.
And then to hide what he did, he staged the scene with the pipe and called 911.
That's the theory. It's a terrifying scenario.
Chilling. So we've got a dead wife, a husband whose story is falling apart, and a theory that points to murder. What happens when this goes to trial?
Okay, well, the trial itself is a whole other roller coaster.
Yeah.
Todd sticks to his story. He says he's innocent.
But how does the prosecution prove their case? What were their biggest challenges?
They had tons of evidence showing a staged scene and a made-up story. But there's one big missing piece.
What's that?
Motive. Why would Todd kill Barbara? What reason could he possibly have?
That's the million-dollar question. Did they ever figure that out?
They didn't focus on motive.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, they just laid out all the facts, all the evidence, and let the jury connect the dots.
So they basically said, here's the evidence, you decide.
Exactly. They used the forensic evidence, the witnesses, and even Todd's own words to build their case. And it was a risky move, but the defense decided to put Todd on the stand.
Ooh, that's a gamble, because then he's open to cross-examination.
Exactly. And that's where things got really interesting. The prosecution used Todd's own testimony to find even more holes in his story.
How do they do that? Can you give us an example?
Well, think about Barbara's work schedule. She was supposed to be at work by 8:00, right?
Gee, punctual Barbara.
But according to Todd, they were still driving around at 8:00. The prosecution said she would have called if she was going to be late. She was super reliable. But she didn't call because she couldn't, because she was probably already hurt.
Makes sense. So they used the timeline to challenge his story.
Yep. And remember how Todd said he punched the windshield with both hands trying to block the pipe?
Yeah, I remember that.
Well, they brought in a forensic expert who said the injuries on his hands didn't match the force needed to break safety glass.
Another inconsistency.
And didn't he originally say those injuries were from working with glass?
He did, even though his job didn't involve glass at all.
Yeah, another lie. The prosecution used all of this to show that he wasn't trustworthy, that he was trying to cover up something terrible.
So you have these two completely different versions of events. The prosecution saying he's a killer, and the defense saying he's just a grieving husband caught in a bad situation.
Yeah.
What did the jury think about all this?
It must have been so hard for them to decide who to believe. They had to weigh all the evidence and figure out what really happened that day. It's a huge responsibility.
And after all that, what was the verdict? What did they decide?
On December 15th, 2017, after 2 days and 9 long hours of deliberation, they found Todd Kendhammer guilty of first-degree intentional homicide.
Wow. So despite not having a clear motive, they believed the evidence was strong enough to convict him.
The jury decided that the staged scene and all of Todd's lies were just too much to ignore.
So that's it then? Case closed?
Oh, not quite. There's more to this story.
What do you mean?
Yeah, he was sentenced to life in prison. No chance of parole.
Yeah.
But even with the guilty verdict, this story doesn't really end there.
What do you mean?
Well, Todd still says he's innocent. He's always maintained that Barbara's death was an accident. And the really tough part is, his children believe him.
That's just heartbreaking. Imagine the position they're in. To believe their dad, they have to believe their mom's death was just a freak accident. But to accept the jury's verdict means believing their father is a murderer.
Yeah, it's a really complicated situation. It shows how strong family bonds can be, and how we as humans sometimes cling to what we believe, even when there's evidence that says otherwise. Sometimes the truth is just too hard to face.
It's a reminder that every story has different sides, and that even when someone's found guilty, there can still be questions, doubts that linger. But aside from what happened to the Kendhammer family, this case tells us a lot about how we investigate crimes.
Right. It shows how important forensic science is, especially in cases that seem simple at first. Remember that trainee officer, the one who noticed the dirt and the blood?
Yeah, he was key to the whole thing.
He had a feeling something wasn't right. And he followed procedures, even though it seemed like an open and shut case.
It was like he instinctively knew to look closer.
And because of that, those early observations led to the forensic analysis, which was huge in this case.
Right.
The plug spatter, the windshield, the injuries, all of it pointed to murder, not an accident.
It's like the science itself told the story.
It's amazing how far we've come with forensic science. It can uncover the truth even when it seems impossible.
It makes you think about all the cases that were maybe misjudged before we had these techniques. So what's the big takeaway here? What does the Kendhammer case teach us?
Well, for me, it shows that things aren't always what they seem. We tend to judge based on first impressions. But the truth is usually more complicated. This case reminds us to think critically, to question what we see and hear, not just accept everything as fact.
And for anyone out there who thinks that could never happen here, this case shows that even in small towns, bad things can happen.
It also makes you think about how we perceive things. Todd's kids choosing to believe him, even though he was found guilty, shows how strong denial can be, how we hold on to our beliefs even when they're challenged.
This case really brings up a lot of questions about science, about faith, about how complicated people are. But even with the conviction, there's one question that we're still left with.
The motive. What would make a man kill his wife after 25 years? Was it a moment of anger? Years of resentment? Something else entirely? We may never know the answer. It might be locked away in Todd Kendhammer's mind forever.
It's a reminder that some cases, even when they're closed, leave us with more questions than answers. A feeling of mystery, like we'll never know the whole truth. And in the end, it's just a sad story for Barbara, for her family, and for everyone touched by this case. This story was sourced from an episode of the podcast Anatomy of Murder.